Okay, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This is Khaldun Swice for Logically Faithful. I have a very special guest today with me, Dr. Roy Baumeister, social psychology and area director, and Francis Eminent scholar at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. I'm not sure if you're still doing that role since you're in.
No.
Okay, you're in Utah. Maybe I'm reading an older bio here, but I know you're president of the Positive Psychology. And you have done some significant work on the self, social rejection, belonging, sexuality, self-control, self-esteem, defeating the negative behaviors, self-defeating behaviors, motivation, aggression, and primarily with your work on 20 different books and 300 different publications. It's really amazing. My focus today will be on his amazing and absolutely remarkable book, Is There Anything Good About Men? Sometimes I have to ask myself that question about myself. But let's go ahead and get started then, Doctor. Would you prefer doctor or as a professor?
Anything is fine.
Okay. Well, I want to honor your titles there as well. Well, tell us a little bit about the book. How was it received when it came out? And what is any current work that you're doing on this issue on manhood or masculinity?
Well, I've been considering writing a further follow-up book, but this one came about a while ago.
Yeah,
Uh,
over 10 years.
my project is to understand the big picture of what makes us human and the essence of human life and the human condition. And well, gender is a difficult topic, but it's part of everybody's everyday experience. So I felt I couldn't ignore it, and I started looking at the research literature. And it's clear there's a pretty strong bias in it that which I think ordinary people probably can relate to it just from listening to the news. You often hear stories about, oh, women are better than men at this or that or whatever, but you never hear the reverse. When was the last time you heard that men were better than women at something? Likewise, I read some advertising researchers who studied ads in which men and women disagree, and one found that 100% of the time the woman was right. Uh, you never see ads in which a man and a woman have some disagreement and the man ends up ends up winning. Same thing in the movies and television and so on. It's fine to depict males both as good and as bad characters, but bad female characters are extremely rare. Uh, so I look
Yes,
at
I
the world
noticed
in
that in
terms
your
of
book as well. You talked about the detailed analysis of a lot of the sitcoms from the 90s to the 2000s. Most
all
of
right.
them mock men as the typical Homer Simpson idiot.
Yes. Yes, and it's not plausible that nature would make one gender all around better than the other. I mean, just as people used to think that men were generally superior to women, now people think that women are generally superior to men. Neither of them is really plausible. If there's a better way to be, like having two legs instead of three or one, everybody will converge on that. Evolution will select in favor of that. It will, however, preserve differences when there's a trade-off, when one trait's better for one thing and another better for something else. So I think we can understand genuine differences between men and women on that way. But whenever you hear one gender is better at one thing, you probably want to look at what is the corresponding thing that the other one is better for. And it's completely missing from the research literature and from the public discussion. Hence the title, Is There Anything Good About Men? How could it be that everyone relentlessly reports female superiority all over the place? And it's also obviously implausible just in terms of the history of the world. Almost all the progress of civilization from the Stone Age to the present, 98% of that was achieved, accomplished by men. So for people to come around to thinking that women are superior human beings, and yet, yeah, what have they done? What have they contributed? What have they accomplished? It's a little implausible. So I came up with a book. I called it A Radical Theory of Gender Equality. That ultimately nature will make the best men and women that it can, and they may be different in some ways. So one will be better at one thing, one is better at something else. But probably when you add everything up, they're going to be extremely close to even.
Right. I noticed you called the standard feminist model that degrades men or minimizes the difference between men and women called the imaginary feminist. Um, and doing my own research on feminism, I find it's, of course, it's not a monolithic group. There's so many variations with you and extremes, just like within the men's movement, I suppose.
Yeah, what I was doing was not really dealing with the whole corpus of feminist thought, which is all over the place and allows them to say whenever you criticize them, say, "Well, that's not feminist," because other feminists think something else, which is a
Or
bit of
Marxism, yeah.
a sleight of hand trick. But rather, we've all been educated with feminist biases, and so they automatically work in the mind, and we automatically think in favor of women and feel in favor of women. So that's what I was trying to tackle as the imaginary feminist. It's this automatic biased response that we have. Um, I needed to tackle that because people will automatically be thinking things in response to points. It's hard not to stop. For example, sometimes what I use is well, one big social achievement is creating a new country, right? I mean,
Right.
that's a huge advance in the social organization. So there are 200 countries in the world, roughly. Do you think half of them were created by groups of men and half by groups of women? I can't find a single one that was created by groups of women. Women have not done that at all. And people almost cannot hear that without really trying to make up excuses for women. Oh, the men didn't allow them, or they had to take care of the babies, or I don't know what. Countries were created by warfare, which something men did, or um, so again, you can see the bias operating yourself, and I have it. I have it too. I was brought up with the same training, although I'm old, so it wasn't as extreme when I was young
Mhm.
as it is for young people today who get, starting from kindergarten, if not earlier, indoctrinated with all these ideas of female superiority, and we must always make excuses for women and cannot say that women are inferior to men on anything, but we can say men are inferior on plenty of things.
Right, right. Yeah, there's a social stigma about that. I'm always hearing people say, meet my better half, for example, which is always the woman. And I've seen it, and not only in Hollywood theater, but it's just in the common everyday social interactions I meet with people. But let's do some pushback on some of that. Is Are women or have women been able to build things, even like refrigerators or even household appliances, which are all built primarily by men? Even the birth control or even the tampon was invented by men, which allowed women to have more access in the workforce for long periods of time. But the common pushback is, of course, there was male oppression. Male would not allow women into the educational environment.
Yeah, I
Even,
don't see any
so
real
how do you
evidence
deal with that?
of oppression. I think it's highly questionable. We should at least question it. I mean, it's sort of victim thinking that I didn't do anything, therefore other people must be oppressing me, and so on. I think the reality is simply that the men work together to create these things, and the women don't work together to create such things. And so if we go back to the hunter-gatherers, it was a pretty much even start. The hunter-gatherers were highly egalitarian. Indeed, it was an interesting mystery how that came about because the apes from whom we evolved are very hierarchical, starting with the strongest male on the top and so on, and the females have hierarchy too. Um, and through most of history, really up until probably the 20th century, even maybe the middle of that, men spent most of the day with other men and women spent it with women. So there were separate spheres starting out equal, and yet all the progress came from the men's sphere. Now the women say, oh, you didn't include us,
Mhm,
but that's kind of a cheap shot. Why didn't you do anything yourselves?
mhm,
Women certainly could have done it, but there's this, to me, it's one of the big puzzles about understanding men and women is what is the deficit in woman to woman relationships? It's
mhm,
still found in plenty of places today, although uh, there's plenty of bias in the even in the research community to try to suppress that information. But for example, there was a meta-analysis in Psychological Bulletin, which is an extremely rigorous journal about 10 years ago,
Okay.
looking at cooperation. So who is more cooperative, men or women?
Right.
Uh, they did it with those economic games that you have to choose between cooperating with others or taking care of yourself, pursuing your own individual advantage. And they found, well, men cooperate with men, men cooperate with women, women cooperate with men, but women don't cooperate with women nearly as
Hmm.
much.
Hmm.
And even if they start off cooperating, if anything goes wrong, it breaks down much faster. Women to women relationships at all levels are more unstable than men to men relationships. Um, Even in romantic relationships, the lesbians have the highest breakup rate. Remember, this first was found in the early 80s in a very rigorous, detailed study that followed couples over a couple of years, I think. Uh, and I was surprised because everyone believed the women were the strongest attached and so on, but they actually had the highest breakup rate compared to gay males or married, heterosexual
Interesting.
married couples.
Interesting.
Um, it's
Hmm.
the same in, there was even a study of roommates, college roommates who are randomly assigned to live together. And you looked, well, do they stay together for the second year? And the men stay together more than the women. So there's something there, and it's clearly still true. There are recent studies on mentoring. Women don't like women bosses. There was a big article that showed that young women researchers who work with older men, senior men, have a better career than those who attach themselves to older female workers. And the
Hmm.
older females were very indignant about that and mounted a campaign to have the article retracted.
Hmm.
But the findings had already gone through peer review. They were quite legitimate and realistic. And indeed, the response to insist on suppressing that information kind of validates the point. I mean, if yeah, I did a thought experiment. Imagine it had been the other way around, that some young male researchers had come up with a giant data set to show that young men, male scientists, were better off working with women than
Hmm.
men. What would the senior men have done? I can't believe
Hmm.
we would have said, oh, we need to suppress that article and take it out of
No.
the literature. They would have said, well, if it's not true, let's get some other evidence
Right.
and make a case for the opposite. I also think they would have said, well, if it's true or if that's what the evidence, then we owe it to the young man to let them know it, even if it means we don't have as many colleagues to work with ourselves. We
Hmm.
got to take care of the next generation of young men. And if they're better off working with a woman than with a man, they should have that information to help them make the most successful career. But instead, the senior women said, no, 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 we're going to take care of ourselves, and to heck with the younger women. They basically threw the young women under the bus to deny them that information. So that
Why do you
female
think that
dependent,
is at a psychological level, that there's such
yeah.
antagonism between feminine females with each other? I'm curious.
Well, this is something to speculate about. So we're going off of, I mean, what I've said so far is pretty solidly supported by lots of data. Um, the way I've been thinking about this recently uh, is that um, the key to human evolution was getting the male to be the provider, to take care of the of the baby. Basically, as human beings, culture is our strategy. All species have to solve survival and reproduction. We do it by organizing our society with culture, where we work together to produce more resources. Um, and for that, for culture, you need a bigger brain, which is too big to grow inside the woman. I mean, even a 5-year-old child doesn't have a mature brain yet, but can you
Mm.
imagine a woman being pregnant for 5 years, holding
Mm.
a baby inside her, and then giving birth to a 5-year-old boy? That would kill her to squeeze it out. So the only solution is that human babies are born premature by ape standards. Um, and so they have to do all their brain growth in, 8 or 9, 10 years after they are born before they can take care of themselves. And for that, then you need a provider. The mother isn't able to nurse and provide for the child, especially if she has several, for all that time when she's pregnant for others. None of the other apes are interested in fatherhood at all. This is a big difference for fathers. I mean, I don't know if you're a father, but I know lots and lots of men who spend 20 or 30 years or more providing food and shelter and protection and so forth for their children and for the mother of their children.
Right.
which, for a gorilla would have thought that's ridiculous. Why should he be feeding the mother of his children? He doesn't even see any point in his own children.
Mhm.
It's just some gorilla he had sex with 5 years ago. Why
Mhm.
does he
Mhm.
owe her
Mhm.
food every day? So this is a huge, big change to the psyche, and there were a whole bunch of things in evolution to bond the male and the female together for 8 or 10 years. The hunter-gatherers usually didn't, as far as I can make out, didn't mate for life the way some people do, but they made it for long enough to help the children get there. So this doubles the workload on the men. So the men figured out ways to start working together, like hunting in groups and so on, to produce resources more effectively.
Mhm.
Once the men did that, the women could have done that too, but instead they evolved more to get the resources from the men because the men's sphere started producing more. And so for women, it became the evolutionary press to attach themselves to productive men. And so women, even to this day, are really more turned on by high status men who have power and money and so on, and who can take care of them and provide for them. The men still compete and strive to achieve. I remember Joyce Benenson's research, where she asked kids, 8, 10-year-old kids, to talk about their friends. What are they like? And
Mhm.
the boys all talked about the other boys, what they were good at. And, he's good at swimming, but I'm better at baseball. And, they had everybody ranked and so on in terms of what their capabilities are. And she didn't hear any of this from the girls. The girls talked about who was nice, who would return a favor if you did a favor for them, which again shows this already attaching to others by
Mhm.
exchanging favors, which is
Partnerships. Yeah.
for women to attach to men.
Mhm.
And the older girls knew who was attractive to boys. That was salient to them, and they talked about that. So
That's
already
interesting
at
because
this
I still
top,
do that with my colleagues too. We talk about each other's abilities and what we produce rather than what we like to like about each other. Yeah.
yeah, I think so too. And you go to conferences. I'm sort of quiet usually. I sit in the background and listen to other people talk,
Yeah.
and groups of men will talk about capabilities and
Mhm.
ideas and who did well and stuff like that.
Publications. Yeah.
Men all know who has the most publications and and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But the women's talk is, how have you been and how are you feeling and how are your children, and a lot of personal stuff. But there's much less of this competition and equality, and much less discussion
Mhm.
of ideas. At least that's my impression. I
It's
don't have
interesting.
systematic data.
The issue of the hunter-gatherer and the man being the provider protector, which is a predominant role in almost yeah, no exceptions in all cultures I've seen in history of the world for that. Some of my feminist colleagues have tried to point out some matriarchal cultures, but I've looked into them. They don't last long, or they're just kind of superficial. It was like the Themyscira of Wonder Woman, the island of the elusive mythological Amazons who never existed. But the
Right.
issue of protection, which is fascinating. So I was in California giving a paper on technological and theological explanations of existing without the body, which I found fascinating. Anyway, I gave my presentation, and others gave, and this lady got up. This is way before this is about 15 years ago. No, 12 years ago. She got up and she gave a paper on Marxism to a group of 90% men, which generally the kind that come to philosophy conferences. And at the end of her paper, there was a time for Q&A, and some of the guys got up and really tore into Marxism, the problems with it, the bloodshed in history. I mean, went off. Instead of responding, she broke down in tears. And the
Yeah,
guy,
there was
interesting, the men, this is very interesting because I want to tell you what happened here. She left to go to the bathroom, imagine to recuperate herself. The guys went off on each other. How could you treat a woman like this? They were not dealing with the arguments, but I wonder if it was a man doing the same thing. This is what we do. We go off on each other's ideas. So
yes,
under
yes.
that protection that comes up with men, how does that, what do you think about that?
Yes, there was a column around that I read about a year ago and so on, saying that women have introduced crying into intellectual discourse,
Hmm.
even scientific debates, and it's completely it defeats the man if he's arguing one side and the woman starts to cry. What
Hmm.
can he do? He looks bad for making her cry. He can't cry.
Hmm.
Makes him look bad.
Hmm.
Um, all he can do is go away, and so it becomes this kind of bullying technique. I don't know if you can cry on purpose to bully somebody, but
Hmm.
but it certainly works well enough, and then it would be reinforced. Um, the same with name calling, saying that, oh, your views are sexist and therefore they shouldn't be considered. Uh, that in itself is absurd as a scientific argument.
Right, right,
But I tell people, imagine your child were sick and there's only one cure, and it was developed by a Nazi in some kind of racist, genocidal program.
right.
Would you refuse to use it on principle? Well, if you'd let your child die rather than
Yeah,
use a Nazi medicine,
yeah.
then okay, then you can call other scientists out for sexism and have that. But I certainly wouldn't. I don't know anybody else who would. Who cares what the motives of the scientist were
Mm,
behind it? What matters in science is the quality of the evidence and how well it fits the conclusions. Uh,
mm,
and in philosophy, there's less reliance on data of the same sort, but for that reason, much stricter attention to subtleties of logic and precise definitions and all that. That's how scholarly debates are supposed to be held.
right.
Uh, Crying and calling names, it just degrades the whole project.
It does. I'm just wondering that issue, that internal desire, that I would say God-given desire for men to be the provider protector sometimes gets it as a problem when a woman is like presenting a paper, or even in the military. I've seen reports of women on the front lines when a woman is attacked by the enemy. The men will leave their whole platoon and go to defend her and
Yeah,
cause instability on the front lines in the infrastructure of the military complex.
yeah,
Um,
Warren Farrell was talking about that we want to put women in combat, but then it increases the risk on the men who are there. If you're in a group of 10 men and one of them, and there needs to be a dangerous mission, well, you have a 1 in 10 chance of doing it. But if 5 of them are women, the sergeant won't usually send a woman on the dangerous job. So the man's danger is now 1 in 5 rather than 1 in 10, and his odds of being shot and maimed and killed are much greater.
Hmm, hmm. And that has something to do, of course, with the physical characteristics of women and men. I'm wondering how do we
I'm not
how are we
necessarily.
going to
It's
address
probably the
that?
psychological
Right. Like in
characteristic.
Chicago, we have major billboards here trying to get people to recruit for the police force, which after the Black Lives Matter situation had really shot down the morale of police. People were just dropping out or retiring early. So in the ads, they're showing 6 people, 6 women, 3 women and 3 men, and a part of me says no. There's something wrong with putting these women on the front line, these beautiful young women who are in the growing in their careers to deal with the worst of the worst in our society. As police officers, they have to deal with that. But
Well, if
any
we want
on
equality,
that?
then that's what it should be. That the women should do, take equal responsibility and take equal risks.
Hmm,
But it may not often turn out that way. And as we know, far more men are killed in their jobs than women. I have a colleague who says, they do the women's pay day to see how many, in April or something, that a woman has to work longer on average to earn the same amount as men. And there's a lot of baloney in those statistics, but it's there. I have a colleague who says, yeah, they should do the same thing for death on the job. And, a woman would have to spend 6 or 7 years to have the same risk of dying on the job that a man has in 1 year.
hmm. Yeah, and the statistics on that were interesting to show those out. Would be problematic. For example, just the other day, I gave at our philosophy conference here in Chicago, I gave a critique of feminism, and the week before that, we had another philosophy conference. I had a lot of feminists come, friends of mine, who were very outspoken. But when I told them that I'm going to be critiquing feminism, honestly, Roy or Dr. Roy, none of them showed up for the meeting.
None of
And
them showed up.
as you said that in your book, actually, you said that when you critique feminism, they don't even want to hear what you have to say. I'm like, wow, this just seemed to come out reality in that conference.
Yeah, I think that book, Professing Feminism, which was written by two women's studies professors who kind of became disillusioned with the whole enterprise and exposed it. They said feminists only listen to criticism from other feminists, and it's mainly about how pure their feminist ideas are. For someone, a non-feminist, to come along and say, "Well, look, I got data, or I got conceptual problems with it." Um, they just aren't receptive to it, which is kind of worrisome as women take over universities. Are they all going to become like women's studies, where they're about social activism and suppressing dissenting views so as to advance a certain political agenda, which is really poison to the scientific enterprise and its credibility.
It is. And I'm questioning, like even some of my colleagues listening to this interview and others in my audience would say, well, this is just two white men talking about this. By the way, I'm Arab by my background. I'm from the Middle East, but that's irrelevant for some. I'm not sure about your ethnic background. But how you deal with the ad hominem critique? This is men. Even when I did a talk on abortion a while back, I had to actually look for um, two people, one pro, one negative, is what the debate was, but they both has to be women because otherwise they just won't even listen.
Yeah, well, that's again a way of shutting down debate and disregarding views that they don't want.
Hmm.
Again, it doesn't. In principle, from the Enlightenment, which was a product of white men, is one of the greatest advances in world culture.
Hmm.
Uh, what matters is not who says it, but the quality of the arguments, either the logic or the evidence, and that's all that should count. So whether feminism is criticized by a man or a woman or non-binary or whatever, what matters is the data and
Yeah.
and the ideas, are the
Okay.
data and the quality of the
Yeah.
ideas.
So let's deal with some presuppositions that are going to arise here in this discussion with some of my responses and responders. Uh, let's deal with some of the unspokens here. Things you are not saying. You are not saying that men are inherently superior to women or women are inferior to men in this regard as a bashing of the feminine. Let's because you address that in your book. Even you even close the book with this quote where you say that the differences between men and women is not necessarily on what they do, but what they want to do. I think that's something to that effect, where you close off with that. Can you
Yeah, I brought that
comment?
up because the debates often get poisoned by abilities. Are you saying
Right.
men are smarter than women or something like that? There's the big outburst after the Harvard president, Larry Summers, were asked about why there aren't a lot of female math and physics professors,
Right.
said there were just more men at that level. And it looked like he was saying men are smarter than women, and women ran out crying and things like that.
Hmm.
Uh, but uh, but he was completely correct in terms of the data. It's just they're men at both extremes, and so the average. I know there's a new book arguing that there is a difference in adults, a significant difference, but uh, many of the opinion that the mean difference in intelligence between men and women, the average, is almost the same. But there are more men at both extremes. It's much better documented at the low end because we do more research on mental retardation and
Hmm.
impairments and stuff like that. And it's very true that as you go from moderately retarded to, no, or from slightly retarded to moderately to severely retarded, the ratio of boys to girls gets bigger and bigger. So there are more boys at the extreme. But the people who study genius have the same thing as you go from mild genius to moderate to extreme. Again, the ratio is the same. There are women at all levels. There are super genius women and there are super retarded women. There are just more men at both extremes.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so uh, so the differences in abilities, I was saying, are that's what everyone worries about, and it's very sensitive. But I think the bigger differences are in motivation. Desire to have a lot of sex partners, or desire to take care of children, or uh, there's a great paper recently on self-protection, which is a much stronger motivation in women than in men. Again, it was Joyce Benenson, Richard Wrangham, and I forget the third author. I was in a very prestigious journal and focused even just on a lot of biological patterns that the woman's body is more oriented toward protection, probably for obvious reasons, because she's carrying the child, and
Right.
the man is much more expendable at all levels, except for the 5 minutes of sex to
Mhm.
produce the baby.
Mhm.
I mean, having a provider is an advantage, but again, more replaceable and expendable uh, than the mother. And so, but it also goes, it's true in all sorts of social and personal things. I mean, if you look at TV shows, who is doing the crazy, stupid things, taking chances and stuff like that,
Mhm.
it's the males,
Right.
and it's the same in ordinary life. Young men will try and risk a lot of things, and it's one reason some of the men die younger than women.
Mhm.
So there's a motivational difference, which I also talked about in the book, because you remember I said the most underappreciated fact is that we're descended from twice as many women as men. Our ancestors
Mhm.
number women twice as many as
Right.
men. And what that means is that people are surprised by that because equal numbers of boys and girls roughly are born. A couple more
Yeah.
boys, but then they die in childhood a little bit more. Um, Equal numbers are born, but to be an ancestor, you had to reproduce on down to the present. And so most men are dead ends, which means the majority of women have reproduced at most times and places, whereas the majority of men probably did not reproduce. Only half as many men as women reproduced at each step in society. And nature obviously rewards natural selection in favor of reproduction. So
Mhm.
for the woman, it's going to work. Play it safe. Don't take chances. Someone
Mhm.
will come along and have sex with you, and you'll have babies, and your genes will go on into the next generation. That's the thing to do. Don't go sailing off into the unknown to take chances and exploring different parts or do crazy things. Whereas for the men who played it safe, they took themselves out of the gene pool. They didn't reproduce. We're descended from the ones who did take chances and succeeded.
Right. Right.
I don't know that there are
Excellent.
genes for luck, but there's certainly genes for taking chances and trying, and we see that a lot more today, uh, even in hobbies and things people do. I mean, I liked windsurfing for many years, which feels dangerous, but it's actually quite safe, which is why I liked it
Mhm.
because of the thrill
To
you
have
go.
that element of danger that makes it interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, I didn't want to get hurt, but with
Yeah.
windsurfing, if you mess up, you just fall in the water. It's hard to get yourself injured, but it
Yeah.
feels really dangerous.
Yeah.
But again, like 10 times as many men as women would be there on the beach. There would be some, but again, these things appeal to the male more. All the risk taking, sensation seeking, all that, and it's probably with a strong genetic biological basis.
It's
Again, because the woman was more successful by taking care of herself and not taking stupid chances.
right, right. And selecting men who can provide and protect rather than any man who'll come up, which is something in your book. You talked about a recent study back. I know this is over 10 years ago, but I think it's very relevant. In a campus where they walked up to random woman, a young, unattractive or attractive, medium attractive man would act up to a random woman and ask her to sleep with him. And you said 9 times out of 10, they would say no. And the men, it was the exact opposite. Can you talk about that with the issue of the sex drive being apparently
Yeah,
equal between men and women?
that was a classic study. Repson and Elaine Hatfield did that. They ran it a couple times with consistent results. Um, so I assume they had a group of research assistants, both men and women, young men and women, college students, about average attractiveness on average. And they would generally approach attractive people and say, I've been noticing you around campus, and would you like to go to bed with me tonight? And it wasn't 9 out of 10. It was 10 out of 10 of the women said no.
Really? Oh, the 10.
And
Okay.
yet
Yeah.
across two studies, not a single woman said yes.
Wow.
Whereas three-quarters of the men said yes. And even the ones who said no said, oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy tonight. Can we do it tomorrow? Or I just got a girlfriend. I wish I could, and so on. They were
Wow.
really open to that. Um,
And why is that?
uh, it probably shows again the biological evolved difference in mating strategies, and people have written and shown this kind of pattern all over the world. Uh, basically, again, we're dealing with a man who in evolution, probably he's not going to pass on his genes very. So he needs to take advantage of every opportunity. And a man can have sex with 100 different women in a year, and maybe make 30 babies. Uh, and wow, okay,
Right.
that's highly successful. And indeed, Genghis Khan and some successful men have lived lives just like that. Mao Zedong said they should did the same. But for a woman, if she has sex with 100 men, she can still only have one baby a year.
Right, right.
And so, what becomes more important to her is not the quantity of partners, but the quality.
Quality.
And so, she wants to go slow, to evaluate the man, to be very choosy, even if she gets attached to a low quality man and has sex with him and gets pregnant, and then a better man comes along. Well, that's a loss to her. She should have waited. Uh, and as David Buss has pointed out, it's always in the woman's interest to postpone sex a little longer, to make sure, see how strong the man's commitment is. Is he going to stick around and care for her and provide for her and love her and so on, or is he just in it for a quick a dose of pleasure and then on his way to the next one? Uh, for the man, again, that's less of a concern. So um, I think it's pretty widely acknowledged that men desire to have more sex partners, and oddly, they do, even though the numbers don't quite add up.
May I challenge that now? With the recent Gen Z and sociological research, even in my own classes, when I talk to young ladies who are very vocal about how many, they call it body count of
Yeah.
men that they have. Some of these young ladies, 23, 30, they have like 50, 60, and they're vocal about it. And very like in my generation, it would have been shameful to mention that kind of thing. With the advent of birth control, and now you're circumventing the consequences are like
Yes.
being removed. What about that sex drive? Can you expand on that?
Yes. Well, I mean, that is an interesting development. And um, we know from sex research that people who are the most vocal, even the ones who volunteer to answer the questionnaires, are
Right,
generally
those
having more sex than the ones who are keeping silent.
true, true.
There were two big sex studies that came out in the 90s. One looked for volunteers, and the other did a really rigorous sample, which is difficult to do, to try to get everybody
Mhm.
to participate. And the amount of sex they were reporting were just hugely different. And it's because, again, people who aren't interested in having sex, who aren't having very much, they don't feel like talking about it, right? It's the ones who do are much more interested in it and more willing to talk about it as well.
Okay.
Um, so um, yes, and it is an interesting thing. Whereas if a woman's had sex with 50 or 60 different people, would that affect her mate value to others? In the past, it did, although I don't really have a good grasp of that, because women tell each other, or they used to, if you have sex with too many men, then no one will marry you. But that doesn't appear to be empirically true. Even a lot of the prostitutes, the sex workers,
Mhm,
end up getting married,
mhm,
and they have clients who want to marry them,
mhm.
and so on. So.
Mm.
Um, so there's a difference between the myth and the reality, and
The reality, and there's like a sacredness to sex that has a religious or a powerful element to it that makes it sacred and special, and that seems to have shifted throughout our cultural ethos after birth control.
that may have diminished quite a bit.
Right.
Yeah.
There's something in your book which I postulated, making an analogy of it. You said men take up the extremes of societies, and I put it up this way, and I want to get your feedback on this. Imagine a building, or most cultures are a building, a 10-story building, where men take up the top 2 or 3 floors of the building, which encompasses like ambassadors, presidents, world leaders, etc. Um, and then the bottom, all the way in the bottom half of the building, you take up people like in the criminal enterprise or on death row or working in the sewage or creating the infrastructure of society, which are necessary. You can't
Hmm.
flush the toilet unless somebody fixes it, right?
Hmm.
Others, and all these are 99% men. And then it starts to even out when you get to the middle. The teachers, doctors, professors, economists, etc. You have more and more men and women in these roles. And it seems to me that at least, or the imaginary feminists or the feminists are arguing we want to take off the glass ceiling and rise up to this top level, but they seem to conveniently ignore the lower levels that also
Right.
have men in them. Can you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think that's one of the basic fallacies in the feminist critique, is they look at the top and see men there and say, "Oh, it must be great to be a man. The men have all the advantages." But
Mhm.
if they looked at who's in prison, who's homeless, who's
Suicide rates, yeah.
unemployed or can't find anyone to have sex with, or whatever, you find men more than women at the bottom of society as well. Certainly, victims of crime are much more male than female. So um, men men obviously go to extremes. They undertake more things. They take more chances, which again will produce the extreme differences. And as for the building, there's a style of thought which maybe you as a philosopher will appreciate, that people talk as if there's men and women and then there's society. And
Mm,
they forget that the society was had to be built there in the first place, and it was
right.
built by men. So in your building of society, well, men built it. Uh,
Mm,
and then women gradually moved in, and they moved into the middle floors because they didn't like the bottom
thanks.
and they couldn't get to the top or didn't want to take the chances.
Yeah.
I know this Dutch professor, Agneta Fischer. I always admired her work, and I met her one time. So I said, "What have you been working on?" And she said, "Well, I wanted to do research on the glass ceiling." So I got
Mm,
connected with a great big company, and I measured the men's and the women's attitudes at the entry level and at the executive top level.
mhm.
And said at the entry level, there were equal numbers of men and women, but they had really different attitudes. The men were driven and ambitious and competitive, and the women just kind of wanted a nice job, and they would move up and so on. She said, when you look at the top level, there are no differences in attitudes. The men and the women there are all driven and
Cutthroat.
competitive and so on.
Yeah.
It's just there
Uh-huh.
are a lot more men there. So she
Mm,
said, it's pretty obvious what happens. It's not a glass ceiling. It's the ambition to make the sacrifices to get there, and the women who feel that way do just fine, but not as many women feel that way.
mm. Margaret Thatcher, the longest running Prime Minister of England, they called her the Iron Lady because she was just tough as nails. I imagine she needed to be at that top level of society.
Yes, I imagine people do. I sometimes ask people who's the greatest or most important woman of the 20th century. To me, she wins hands down. I can't think of anyone who comes close. Especially if you consider she pulled England out of being the sick man of Europe and its disastrous economy, won a war in the process, which probably saved her from losing the next election, and made it, a fairly rich country. It created the basis for the 90s. And then if you add in that Ronald Reagan, the American president, basically copied her stuff,
Yeah, brilliant.
got it, and created the American golden age of the 90s,
Right.
in which, again, both the conservatives were replaced by liberals as heads of state. We had Bill Clinton over here, who's one of my favorite presidents, who actually balanced the budget and everything, and Tony Blair over in the UK.
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, I think she was tremendously successful. There are women who could do this, but again,
Interesting.
not as many, and not as many women want to do it.
Right, right.
Politics is a high risk job,
Mm.
so it just doesn't appeal to women. My political science friends who talk about gender sort of say quietly, yeah, there are less women at all levels of politics. It somehow doesn't grab them or appeal to them as much.
No, no, no. Not all of them have the what it takes to be a Hillary Clinton or something to that effect to deal with everything. Yeah, I remember a lot of my friends at Oxford, I used to teach there, bemoaned that Margaret Thatcher got rid of the free education at the higher levels of education. But what it did create is people to only the best of the best could actually get the positions there or even apply for those positions, which again weeded out more men on that level, right? Again. are rising up because they're willing to take the risks. They're willing to put up with the 80, 90-hour week jobs on that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. People who work 80, well, from what I've read in research, people who claim to work 80 hours don't usually work that much. They're exaggerating, but still, the people who work the longest hours, more than the 40-hour week, are very disproportionately men. I
Mm,
read one survey in The Economist some years ago that was something like 80% of the of their. And I knew Marilyn Maklowitz, who wrote some books on workaholics. And I read her book. I
yeah.
knew her in college, and I said, "Oh, it's a great book, but all your examples are men." And she said, "Huh, I didn't really think about it," because she was a workaholic
Yeah.
herself. But she said, "Yeah, it's true." She said, "I never counted or even thought about gender, but yeah, it's clear the
Mhm.
workaholics are men." But again, we can see that through a natural selection lens. Being successful at work really enhances a man's mating prospects,
Right.
and it doesn't do as much for a woman.
Yeah.
Indeed,
Yeah.
some say it actually reduces it. If the woman insists on marrying men richer than herself or with higher salaries, then the higher she rises, the fewer men there are above her. The
This is
women don't.
interesting. Yeah, it has something to do with of course, hypergamy, with a woman constantly choosing men who are higher status than them, equal or higher, and men choosing women who are equal or lower.
Right.
Um, seems to be across the road or across the demographics of the world. There's something I want to bring up regarding that issue of happiness and women choosing these careers. It seems to lower their sexual attractiveness, especially single women in their 40s, according to the research I've been looking at from Pew and Yale, I believe it is. They said that the unhappiness ratio, even when the New York Times published a recent article regarding the unhappiness of women in the workforce, although feminism had made major strides of putting women on the moon, more secretaries of state and world rulers are women than ever before, but their happiness ratio has gone down, especially for single women in these jobs. Wherein for men, they become more and more attractive when they are, but women become less and less attractive, especially being single, having these positions if they don't have a family. Can you touch on that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's again, both men and women seem to mate that way, that the man is on average a couple of years older, half a degree more educated, slightly higher salary or social class, and so on. Um, but it does mean that as the woman rises high, she doesn't uh, have as big a pool of eligible partners or those who are
Right.
interested in
Or they're
her.
intimidated by her.
Women executives don't marry their male secretaries the way the
Yeah.
male executives used to marry their female secretaries. Um,
Tell us why that is on a psychological or subconscious level.
well, I'm here persuaded by the evolutionary argument that the woman is looking for the man who will provide for her, whereas the man is looking for an attractive woman, and usually
Yeah.
someone young and healthy and fertile, because she can have more babies. I think David Buss had the argument to say, well, imagine way back in the primeval forest, imagine half the men desired to have sex with older women and half the men desired to have sex with younger women. And
Mhm.
suppose everybody got what they wanted and married and had a lovely time.
Mhm.
Who are we descended from?
Right.
Where the men who had sex with older women
Right,
didn't
right,
have
right, right.
babies, so they took themselves out of the gene pool. The
Interesting.
men who were attracted to the young and healthy women,
Eliminate
that's
themselves, yeah.
what did it. But again, for the woman, and then there's also the quantity thing.
Mm.
There's a book by Betzig looking at the history of powerful, successful men and what were their sex lives like. And she said she started off being kind of thinking there wasn't going to be much. Look at Hitler and Franco and some of those. It seemed like examples of men. But no, she found overwhelmingly, when you put them all together, the highly powerful, successful men throughout history, usually they would have one mate, but then plenty of others on the side. So they had a
Mm.
primary
Mm.
wife or queen or whatever,
Mistress.
with
Yeah.
which they made the privileged offspring who were going to take over and lavished all the things on them. But at the same time, they would get around and go to bed with an assortment of mistresses or concubines or whatever. The desire for sexual variety, the novelty, that's simply a new woman shows interest in sex for you, and that's an immediate turn on for most men, in a way that it isn't for women. And so
Generally, yeah.
again, being head of state, probably if Margaret Thatcher had wanted to have a bunch of lovers, she could she could have
What up,
she could
right?
have arranged it. And we talk about like Catherine the Great of Russia, who was a very powerful powerful ruler, and indeed fairly masculine herself and tough as nails in how she ran the country, and supposedly had quite an assortment of lovers to entertain her. It can be done, but that doesn't really appeal to most people. I
Right, right.
sometimes use the example of groupies.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
Both
saw that
men
in the
and
book.
women desire and fantasize about having sex with movie stars and sports stars and stuff like that. The fantasy is pretty gender neutral. Everybody has
Right.
it, but only women can really do it. She
Mhm.
go up to a famous man, an unknown woman, and offer to have sex with him, and often as not, he'll be glad to do it. Whereas a unknown man approaching a famous woman, offering to have sex with her, she's going to call
Have them
security.
arrested.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's interesting. Let me I gotta slowly end this interview, but let's talk about romance a little bit.
Okay.
So in your book, you talk about a study done by Patty and Corte, or am I saying the name wrong? Corte's book on her classroom experience of having students go out to take a look at people on campus and watch men and women walking, and to look at the hands of the people walking. If you
All right.
notice, the hand that's over is usually the man leading. And if you look at the people who are walking with children, which they probably had on campus for childcare, we're also leading the children with the hand over. And her
Hmm.
analysis was that this is an oppressive thing for men to do to women because they're leading. I don't, it seems like more romantic than it is oppressive, like a Romeo leading the Juliet kind of thing. But
But
tell us
I
about that.
when I
Like the
read
man
that,
paying for dinner, for example.
well, when I read that about the hand holding, I thought, that's interesting. I wondered, and I noticed with my girlfriend or wife or whatever, I doing the same thing. So I said, all right, let's do it the other way.
Yeah,
So I kind of insisted on
did you?
taking the rear. But
Uh-huh.
what happens then is, because my arm is longer, my forearm is banging against the back of her forearm, and it's just
Interesting.
uncomfortable to do.
Mm,
It's not a leading or a power thing,
mm,
but I mean, the argument is an example of the feminists using their intellectual powers to look for new things to be offended about and complain about. But it has a much more basic and mechanical explanation. If you have two people, I bet if you got two gays of different heights, you would
mhm.
find that the taller one
Bigger one, right?
has
Yeah.
the front hand too, because it isn't then banging against the other, which spoils the pleasure of holding hands.
Mm.
It's supposed to be this intimate connection, and it is a pleasure to do, but not if every step your forearm gets uncomfortably bumped.
That's right. That's right. Let me conclude with one question on the question of how we see things and people. So I teach world religions, and one of the things we look at in the Torah, especially in the book of Genesis, where God created man out of the dust of the ground, but he created the woman out of the side of the man, or the rib, is the old adage. And it's interesting that men would go back to the dust, or the world, to look at the things to rebuild them and create order out of chaos. And
Interesting. I hadn't made
woman
that connection.
would go to the men or people to create order out of psychological chaos or build people up. So it seems to be on a sociological or educational level that you find a lot of women going into these types of fields that lead toward building up people, while men build up things like cultures and ideas or nuclear
Yes.
infrastructures. Talk about that, would you, if you would?
Yeah, there was a big meta-analysis review of the literature a couple of years after I completed the book on occupational interests. And one
Yes.
of the big conclusions is the world of things is much more interesting to the men.
Yeah.
The women look for jobs where they deal with people. They're more oriented toward that.
Mhm.
I know even the two great evolutionary psychologists, Tooby and Cosmides.
Mhm.
Uh, I don't know if you know them, but a wonderful couple. Done both of them done lots of brilliant work. I had
Mhm.
lunch with them on one of my sabbaticals at
Yeah.
their university, and the woman was just sort of teasing the man. She says, "Yeah, I call it the dead world. He's interested in the dead world, physics and chemistry and stuff." He said,
Or
"Me,
ideas like philosophy or theology. Yeah, yeah.
once we have life, then she got interested, but
Mhm.
the dead stuff, the inanimate interests the man." And so again, this goes back to what I was speculating about at the beginning, that the men worked together to create resources, which meant developing mastery over the physical world, or it's building things or hunting things or whatever, whereas the woman strategy was to focus on people, her child, which she has to take care of, and the man she attaches to help provide for her.
Mhm.
And it's a more of a one-on-one kind of relationship too.
Yeah.
That's very well supported too. People, social psychologists have the idea that women are more social because they're more often pushing for marriage and close relationships and so
Right.
on. But well, if you start to look at things people do not in twos but in large groups, those are almost always men things, starting with team sports. There are even experiments where they'll have two children playing, and the researchers will bring in a third. And if it's two girls, they don't really want the third one there. They will exclude her and kind of keep her out.
Yeah, they're pretty mean. They even have a term, mean girls out there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Whereas two boys, they're fine to let the other boy in. And my point is, it's not that they're mean or anything like that. It's just for two girls, they're looking for the one-to-one connection. So adding the third spoils it. But for the
Well, the
boy,
third
it
one would
doesn't.
think that. Yeah.
For the boys, it doesn't spoil it to add
Mm.
more. And oh, sure, come on, bring them along.
Right. Bring them along.
And so
Interesting.
boys naturally form into bigger groups.
Bring the groups. That's right. That's interesting. Well, as we conclude this interview, Professor, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it and the work you're doing. And I'm really interested in diving into your other books on the self. That's very fascinating to me of what it means to be the self, which I'm interested in looking into at a later
All right,
point.
well, be glad to come back sometime and talk about that. That's been a project. I spent probably 10 years on that book.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
not 8 hours every day, but
Right.
but
I got you. Yeah, I
there's a
understand
lot
what
of
you
time
mean.
to get that
Yeah.
done.
Well, any final words of encouragement to the men out there or women listening to our conversation here?
Yeah, the feminists have pushed this idea that men and women are basically in conflict, whereas if I look at the history of the world, more often than not, they've been partners. And most men and women find ways to work together and help and support each other and cooperate. And yeah, they're different in some ways, but probably complementary. I like Helen Fisher's point that men and women are like 2 feet, the left foot and the right foot. They're not the same, but they need each other.
Mm,
And when they work together and cooperate, that's when you can go somewhere.
right. That's really great.
That's
Beautiful
so
thing.
I think
Right.
that's a great image.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a great point to close on. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating to me, and thank you.
Okay, thank you. Um, have you finished the recording?
Yeah, closing now. Stop. Okay, stop.
Okay.